They say you can't fight City Hall. But my grandfather didn't believe in fighting fair. Police Chief Harlan Keene arrested me for trespassing in my own inherited lake house. He thought he'd cleared the way for a multi-million-dollar shoreline development. Then my lawyer walked into the station with our family's 1872 land grant. The document didn't just prove ownership. It contained a reversion clause that would void every single contract the town had signed. That smirk on Keene's face vanished the moment he saw the wax seal. I'd been living in that house for 3 months. My divorce was final. My savings were gone. The only thing I had left was a sagging porch and a wood stove that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. Cedar Bluff wasn't much, but it was mine. Free and clear. That's what I thought. The town had annexed the shoreline for a luxury development, and Police Chief Harlan Keene had decided my inherited property was standing in the way of progress. What none of them knew, what the council, the developers, the lawyers, none of them could have known, was that my grandfather had been preparing for this fight since before the town even existed. My grandfather, Ellis Woodward, bought that shoreline in 1956 for the price of a used Buick and a promise to keep the cedar trees standing. He was a surveyor by trade, a man who understood that land isn't just dirt, it's a story written in metes and bounds, and the person holding the oldest page usually wins. For 60 years, he paid his property taxes with a personal check delivered by hand to the county clerk's office, always on the first Monday of January, always with a note that said Cedar Bluff, Woodward tracked in his small, exact handwriting. Nobody questioned it, because there was nothing to question. The land was his, but when the county merged its records into a digital system in 2014, something got lost in the migration. That something was my grandfather's entire parcel. It vanished from the database like it had never existed. My grandfather was already 92 by then, his eyesight failing, and nobody at the assessor's office thought to knock on his door and ask why a 12-acre lakefront property had no digital footprint. They just stopped sending tax bills. I didn't learn any of this until after he passed. I was 41, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio. That smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs, reeling from a divorce that had been less a separation and more a surgical removal of everything I thought my life would be. The call from my grandfather's attorney came on a Tuesday. My presence was required at the reading of the will. I drove 6 hours to Cedar Bluff in a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a muffler that wheezed on the highway and arrived at a town that felt like it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone like me to show up and ruin everything. The house was worse than I remembered. A 2-bedroom clapboard shack with a porch that listed left like a drunk at closing time. The wood stove rusted, the windows painted shut. But the shoreline, that shoreline was the kind of view that made developers draw up plans before they'd even checked who owned the ground beneath their feet. And that, it turned out, was exactly what they'd done. The town of Cedar Bluff, population 4,000, had been quietly annexing the lakefront for 3 years under a revitalization plan nobody bothered to mention to the public until the contracts were already signed. The centerpiece was a luxury development called Shoreline at Cedar Bluff. 60 high-end units, a private marina, a clubhouse with a wine cellar, and a price tag that started at $1.2 million per unit. The project was being driven by a company called Northlake Development Group, backed by out-of-state investors, and facilitated by a town council that had suddenly discovered the civic benefits of becoming a resort destination. Police Chief Harlan Keene was the council's unofficial enforcer, a man who had grown up in Cedar Bluff and had spent 2 decades building a personal fiefdom inside the town's one police station. He was tall, broad, with a thick gray mustache and the kind of handshake that came with invisible strings attached. His son, Tyler Keene, was the architect on the Shoreline project. His brother-in-law, Marcus Duval, served on the zoning board. You see the picture. My grandfather's 12 acres sat directly in the middle of the planned development footprint. They couldn't break ground without it. For months after the annexation, the town had been sending letters to what they thought was a vacant property. When nobody responded, they moved forward under the assumption that the land had reverted to the municipality due to abandoned tax status. Nobody checked the paper records. Nobody called the 80-year-old surveyor who had been living a mile up the road the entire time. They just penciled his land into their spreadsheets and started counting money. When I showed up to claim my inheritance, I was not welcomed as a new resident. I was received as a problem that had been solved prematurely and was now walking around breathing. The first time I met Chief Keene, I was on my porch, pulling up rotted floorboards. He parked his department-issued Tahoe in my gravel drive, stepped out, and adjusted his belt in a way that let me see the holster without pointing at it directly. "You must be the grandson," he said. I stood up, dusted my hands, introduced myself. He didn't offer his name. He already knew I'd know it. "This property," he said, nodding toward the house with the air of a man who had already decided something, "is in a bit of a gray area, title-wise. You might want to get that sorted before you get too comfortable." I told him I had the deed. He smiled, not with his eyes. Deeds can be complicated. Records get updated. Things change. Then he got back in his Tahoe and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a warning that hung in the air like humidity. That was the beginning of a campaign of pressure so methodical it could have been taught in a seminar. First came the code violations. The porch was a safety hazard. The chimney was non-compliant. The septic system hadn't been inspected since the 1980s. Each citation came with a fine and a deadline. Then came the casual conversations around town that I only heard about secondhand. That out-of-towner thinks he can just move in and hold up progress. Shame what he's doing to the old Woodward place. A local bank suddenly declined to open an account for me, citing irregularities in my identification. Keene's officers started driving past my house at all hours, slowing down just enough to make sure I saw them looking. I spent those 3 months trying to get a lawyer. The first two I called were based in the county seat, and both told me they had conflicts of interest they couldn't explain. The third, a woman named Alina Ruiz, who worked out of a tiny office above a bakery, listened to my story for 20 minutes without interrupting, then said quietly, "You need to find every piece of paper your grandfather ever signed. Every survey, every map, every tax receipt. If there's a weakness in their claim, it's going to be in something old." I told her about the leather folio my grandfather had left me, the one with the ribbon tie and the brittle edges. I had only glanced at it after the funeral, assuming it was sentimental history. She told me to bring it to her office immediately. I made a mental note to do it first thing in the morning. Then morning came, and so did the police. 6 a.m. on a Wednesday. Pounding on the door. Not a knock, a command. I opened it in my undershirt and jeans, barefoot, to find Chief Keene standing on my porch with 2 uniformed officers behind him, one holding a document in a clear plastic sleeve. "You're being charged with criminal trespassing," Keene said, as casually as if he was reading a weather report. "This property belongs to the municipality of Cedar Bluff. You have no legal right to be here." I started to speak, but he nodded at the officer with the document, who began reading from the citation. The town had no record of any deed. The property had been declared unclaimed. My occupation was illegal. They cuffed me in my own kitchen while my coffee went cold on the counter. The neighbors across the road stood on their porch in bathrobes, watching. Keene didn't look at them. He looked at me, and his smirk was the smile of a man who had already spent the money this arrest would release. They put me in the back of a patrol car and drove me to the station. I was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell with a metal bench and a drain in the floor. The charge was a Class B misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a fine that would sink me completely. I sat on that bench for 40 minutes, staring at the concrete wall, replaying the smirk over and over, before I remembered the leather folio. It was still in the house, in a trunk under the floorboards in the bedroom, exactly where my grandfather had kept it, and until someone found it, it was the only thing standing between me and absolute ruin. They gave me my phone call. I called Elena Ruiz. They arrested me for trespassing, I said. You need to get to my house. There's a trunk under the loose board in the back bedroom closet. Inside it is a leather folio tied with a red ribbon. That's the evidence. That's the whole case. She didn't ask questions. She just said, I'm on my way. I sat back down on that bench, my hands still aching from the cuffs, and I waited. I didn't know yet about the reversion clause. I didn't know that the 1872 land grant, signed by the state legislature when Cedar Bluff was just a name on a surveyor's map, contained a single paragraph that my great-great-grandfather had insisted upon. A legal tripwire that had lain dormant for 150 years, waiting for exactly this moment. I didn't know that the document sitting in my grandfather's trunk didn't just give me the shoreline, it included a provision that stated, in language so clear it could stop a bulldozer in its tracks, that if the Woodward claim was ever contested by any municipal or private entity, every contract, lease, and development agreement on the contested land would be rendered null and void, and the land would revert entirely to the Woodward estate, free of all encumbrances, in perpetuity. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was sitting in a cell, broke and alone, while a small-town police chief who thought he'd already won was walking toward the holding area, keys jingling, to have a final word with the man he thought he'd just erased. I heard his footsteps on the linoleum and then the sound of the heavy steel door swinging open. Chief Keene stepped through the door like a man who had already written the ending. He was alone now, the two uniforms dismissed. He stood on the other side of the bars with his thumbs hooked in his belt, studying me the way a real estate developer studies a condemned building, not with anger, but with a kind of professional curiosity about how easy it would be to knock it down. Mr. Woodward, he said. Not my grandfather's name. The county records had me listed under my mother's maiden name, and he hadn't bothered to learn it. That small detail told me everything. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a filing error that had grown legs. You look tired, he said. Holding cells have that effect. I didn't answer. I sat on the metal bench, my back against the cinder block wall, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. Not from fear, from the cold. The cell was refrigerated. Deliberately, I was learning, and the drain in the floor exhaled a dampness that seeped through my jeans. Keene pulled a folded document from inside his jacket, the same cream-colored paper stock I would later learn the town used for all its official threats. I'm going to be direct with you, son. You're in a bad spot. The trespassing charge is solid. We have digital records going back 7 years showing no tax payments, no deed registration, no occupancy. As far as the county is concerned, that house is an abandoned structure on municipal land. You broke in. You're living there. That's a crime. I opened my mouth to mention the paper deed, the folio in the floorboards, my grandfather's history. But he held up a hand like he was stopping traffic. Save it. I've heard the story. The old man bought the land, lost the paperwork, someone in the assessor's office forgot to file something. It doesn't matter. The law runs on what can be proved in a courtroom. And what can be proved is that the digital title is clean, the town owns the shoreline, and you are a squatter. He let that word hang, then added, almost kindly, I don't think you're a criminal. I think you're a guy who got some bad information and made a bad decision. So I'm going to offer you a way out. He held up the document. This is a quitclaim deed. You sign it, acknowledging you have no legal interest in the property, and you agree to vacate immediately. In exchange, the town will drop the trespassing charge. You walk out of here tonight with no record, no fine, no jail time. And, he said, as if bestowing a favor, the development group has authorized me to offer you a hardship payment of $5,000 to help with relocation. That's more than generous for someone with no legal standing. $5,000. The number landed in my stomach like a stone. I thought about the lake at sunrise, the way the mist curled off the water, the scent of cedar, the silence that had started to heal something broken in me. I thought about my grandfather's hands, gnarled from decades of holding survey equipment, the way he taught me to read a plat map when I was 10 years old. I thought about the leather folio, still hidden, still waiting, and I thought about the smirk on Keen's face when he'd cuffed me in my kitchen, the neighbors watching, the humiliation burning. No, I said. The word came out quieter than I intended, but it stopped him. His expression flickered, a small crack in the professional veneer. No? He folded the quitclaim document and returned it to his jacket, the motion unhurried. You understand what no means, right? It means the charge stands. It means you sit in this cell until your arraignment, which, given how backed up the county court is, could be 3, maybe 4 weeks. It means you lose everything, the house, your freedom, whatever money you have left fighting a case you will lose. And, he said, leaning closer to the bars, it means that by the time you get out, there won't be a house to come back to. The demolition crew is scheduled for Monday morning. I can hold them off if you sign. If you don't, well, old buildings have a way of falling down on their own. Good luck proving you own something that isn't there. He turned and walked to the door, his hard-soled shoes clicking on the linoleum. He paused with his hand on the handle. You've got until 9 a.m. tomorrow to change your mind. After that, the offer expires. He left without looking back, and the heavy door swung shut with a finality that echoed. I sat in the silence for a long time after that, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I thought about Monday morning, about bulldozers, about the folio still hidden in the floorboards. If I didn't get out of here, the house would be rubble before I ever saw a judge. The deed would be buried under drywall and splintered cedar, and my grandfather's entire life would be reduced to a footnote in a developer's press release. I had one phone call left, and I used it to call Alina Ruiz again. Her phone rang 4 times, then voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady. Alina, it's me. They're going to demolish the house on Monday. There's a trunk, back bedroom closet, under the floorboards. There's a leather folio inside with a ribbon. That's everything. That's the only copy. Please. I hung up and sat back down. And for the first time since the cuffs went on, I felt the full weight of what I was up against. Alina Ruiz had been a public defender for 9 years before she burned out on the assembly line of plea bargains and opened her private practice above a bakery that smelled permanently of cinnamon. She was 43, sharp-elbowed, with a streak of white in her dark hair that she'd earned in a courtroom against a county prosecutor who once told her she was too emotional to try a property case. She won that case. She never lost another one in his courtroom. When her phone buzzed with my voicemail, she was already halfway to my house. She pulled into the gravel drive at 10:30 in the morning, 2 hours after Keene left my cell. The Tahoe was gone, but the neighbors across the road were watching from behind their curtains. Alina didn't care. She walked up to the front door, found it unlocked. Keene's officers hadn't bothered to secure it, and stepped inside. The house was cold, the wood stove long dead. She moved through the kitchen, past the coffee still sitting in the pot, into the bedroom. The closet floor was covered with a worn rug, and when she pulled it back, she saw the outline of a board that didn't quite match the others. She pried it up with a screwdriver from the kitchen junk drawer. Inside was a wooden trunk, small enough to carry, made of cedar, with brass hinges that had turned green with age. She lifted it out and set it on the bed. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a soft groan. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumbling tissue paper, was the leather folio I had told her about. It was tied with a red silk ribbon, faded to the color of dried blood. Alina untied it with the care of someone who understood that old things do not forgive rough handling. She opened the cover. The first document was a property survey, dated 1872, drawn in ink that had oxidized to sepia, showing the boundary lines of a parcel along Cedar Bluff Lake. Below it was the land grant itself, signed by the state legislature and embossed with a seal that still held its raised edges. Alina read the archaic legal language, her finger tracing the lines. Then she turned the page, and her fingers stopped. Her eyes caught the word reversion halfway down the document. She read the clause once, then again, then a third time, because she could not trust what her own training was telling her. The clause stated, in language that had been drafted when legal writing was an art form, that the grant was absolute and irrevocable, and that if ever the Woodward claim to the land was contested by any municipal, corporate, or private party, all contracts, leases, and development agreements entered into on the contested land would immediately become null and void. The land would revert wholly to the Woodward estate. Further, it specified that any party found to have contested the claim in bad faith would be liable for all legal costs incurred by the estate. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, the folio open in her lap, her mind racing. The North Lake Development Group had already broken ground on the adjacent parcels. They had investors, contracts, pre-sales. The town had annexed the shoreline based on the assumption that the Woodward parcel was unowned. If this document was authentic, and the paper, the seal, the chain of signatures all suggested it was, then every contract Northlake had signed was built on a foundation of sand. A single legal filing could collapse the entire project. And Chief Harlan Keene, by arresting me on a trespassing charge, had just triggered the exact provision that guaranteed my ownership in perpetuity. She pulled out her phone and took photographs of every page. Then she made 3 calls. The first was to the county recorder's office, asking for a certified copy of any documents filed under the Woodward name. The clerk returned with nothing digital, but when Alina pressed, he admitted the paper archives from before 1900 were stored in a basement vault that hadn't been fully indexed. The second call was to a title attorney she knew in the state capitol, a man named Gerald Poole, who specialized in ancient land claims. She described the reversion clause. There was a long pause. Then Poole said, quietly, "If that document is genuine, it's a nuclear weapon. I've seen clauses like this maybe twice in 40 years. They were designed to protect homesteaders from exactly this kind of thing. Tell your client to file immediately." The third call was to the Cedar Bluff police station. She asked to speak to me. The desk sergeant told her I was in holding and could not receive calls until my arraignment. Alina hung up, placed the folio inside her briefcase, and walked out of the house. She drove to the county courthouse and filed an emergency motion for my release, attaching photocopies of the land grant and the reversion clause, along with a sworn affidavit detailing the arrest and the pending demolition threat. She hand-delivered the motion to the duty judge, an older woman named Margaret Ellison, who had been on the bench for 20 years and had a reputation for disliking procedural bullying. Judge Ellison read the motion in her chambers while Alina waited in the hallway. 20 minutes later, the judge issued two orders: an immediate stay of demolition on the Woodward property, and an order for my release on my own recognizance, pending a full hearing on the property claim. She added a handwritten note at the bottom of the order, addressed to Chief Keene. Counsel is advised to review the attached exhibit before proceeding further with any criminal charges. The court finds the underlying property dispute to be material to the trespassing allegation. Elena drove back to the Cedar Bluff police station with the judge's order in one hand and the leather folio in the other. She parked in the visitor lot, walked through the front door, and approached the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with a comb-over that had surrendered years ago. She placed the judge's order on the counter. "I'm here to collect my client," she said. "He's being released immediately. I also need to speak with Chief Keene." Now, the sergeant looked at the order, looked at Elena, and something in her expression made him reach for the phone. 5 minutes later, Chief Keene emerged from the back hallway. His face was already red, a man who had been told something he didn't want to hear and was preparing to make it someone else's problem. "What is this?" he said, waving the order that the sergeant had given him. Elena opened the leather folio. Carefully, deliberately, she held it open so Keene could see the 1872 land grant, the embossed seal, the chain of signatures. "This is the original deed to the Woodward property," she said. "Dated March 4th, 1872. Registered with the state legislature before the town of Cedar Bluff was incorporated. It includes a reversion clause that voids every contract, lease, and development agreement on the land if the Woodward claim is ever contested." She paused, letting the silence fill the room. "You contested the claim this morning when you arrested my client for trespassing. You didn't just arrest an innocent man, Chief. You just detonated the legal equivalent of a depth charge under every single deal your brother-in-law and his investors have spent 3 years building." Keene's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Disbelief, anger, then something else. Something that looked almost like physical pain, as if the words had punched a hole in his chest and all the air was leaking out. He grabbed the desk sergeant's counter for balance. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice had lost its authority. It was the voice of a man who had just realized the bridge he'd been walking across was never built. Alina closed the folio and tucked it back into her briefcase. "Release my client," she said. "Now, and pray that Mr. Woodward is feeling merciful. Because my next stop is the county courthouse to file a civil suit for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and conspiracy to defraud a landowner. And I'm going to name you personally. Chief, you. Northlake Development Group, Tyler Keene, Marcus Duval, and the town of Cedar Bluff. By the time I'm done, the only thing left of that luxury development will be a hole in the ground and a lot of very angry investors asking who signed off on a project without checking the paper title." Keene stared at her, his jaw working silently. The desk sergeant looked at his shoes. Somewhere in the back of the station, a phone rang and went unanswered. Alina held his gaze without blinking. The moment stretched, taut and humming. Then, without another word, Keene turned and walked toward the holding cells. Alina followed. He unlocked the cell door with a key that shook in his hand. The steel door swung open, and I saw Alina standing behind him, her briefcase in her hand. her face calm and utterly certain. She looked at me, and she said the three words I had been praying to hear since 6 o'clock that morning. "We're leaving." Now, I walked out of that holding cell with my bare feet on cold linoleum and a rage so quiet I could feel it settling into my bones like calcium. Elena handed me a pair of flip-flops she'd grabbed from my house, along with my wallet and keys that the booking officer had surrendered without meeting her eyes. She didn't say anything as we walked through the front lobby. She didn't need to. The desk sergeant was on the phone, his voice low and urgent, and I caught the words Northlake and emergency meeting before the door swung shut behind us. Outside, the morning sun was blinding. I stood on the station steps, a free man with a criminal charge still hanging over my head, and I breathed air that didn't smell like bleach and stale sweat. Alina opened the passenger door of her 10-year-old Subaru, and I got in. She placed the leather folio on my lap. "Read it," she said. "Page 3, the clause." I opened the folio. The pages crinkled. The ink faded, but legible. The handwriting of a 19th century clerk who had no idea he was writing a time bomb. And there it was, halfway down the third page, in language so dense it took 3 readings to fully absorb. That the grant was absolute. That any challenge to the Woodward claim, whether by public or private entity, would render all contracts, encumbrances, and improvements on the land null and void. And that the land would revert to the grantee's heirs, free of all claims. There was more, a subclause I hadn't noticed before, buried in a dependent paragraph. Any party found to have knowingly brought a false claim against the estate would be liable for treble damages, 3 times the value of the land, and any improvements wrongfully undertaken. At current development valuations, that number was north of $40 million. "Keene has no idea what he stepped in," I said. Alina put the car in gear. "He's about to find out." We drove to her office above the bakery, and for the next 2 hours, she worked the phones. The first call was to Gerald Poole, the title attorney in the capital. He'd already pulled the state legislative archives and confirmed the grant's authenticity. The second call was to a forensic document examiner who could testify to the age of the paper and ink. The third was to a reporter at the county newspaper, a woman named Diane Hatcher, who had been covering the shoreline development with a skepticism that had gotten her uninvited from council press briefings. Alina gave her the broad strokes, off the record for now, but planted the seed. By noon, the story was starting to leak. The town council called an emergency session for 2 o'clock. I wasn't there, but Diane Hatcher was, and she later told me what happened. The council chambers were packed. Northlake Development Group had sent their lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Conrad Bishop, who billed $800 an hour and hadn't lost a zoning fight in 2 decades. Chief Keene sat in the back, his arms crossed, his face still carrying that gray pallor from the morning. The mayor, a nervous man named Leland Briggs, who owed his position to the development block, opened the meeting by insisting that the town's title was secure and that the arrest had been procedurally correct. Then, Alina walked in. She didn't have an appointment. She didn't need one. She walked to the public comment podium, placed a certified copy of the 1872 land grant on the overhead projector. Yes, they still used an overhead projector, and let the document speak for itself. The room went silent as the embossed seal filled the screen. Then she read the reversion clause aloud, slowly, her voice carrying to every corner. When she finished, she said, "As of 6 o'clock this morning, when Chief Keene arrested the rightful owner of this property, this clause activated. Every contract Northlake has signed for the shoreline development is now void. Every pre-sale deposit is unsecured. Every construction lien is unenforceable. and under the treble damages provision. The town of Cedar Bluff and North Lake Development Group are jointly liable for an amount that my office currently estimates at $43 million. The room erupted. Conrad Bishop stood up so fast his chair tipped over. He demanded a recess. The mayor called for order and got none. Diane Hatcher was typing furiously on her phone, and in the back of the room, Harlan Keene rose from his seat and walked out the side door without a word. He didn't go back to the station. He went to his brother-in-law's office, the zoning board chairman Marcus Duval, and the two of them spent the next 3 hours trying to figure out how to make a 150-year-old piece of paper disappear. But here's the thing about old documents. They leave trails. My grandfather, the surveyor, had not been content to rest on a single land grant. The leather folio contained more than the deed. It contained a chain of title stretching back to the original federal survey, certified copies of every tax payment he'd ever made, and a series of letters spanning 60 years of correspondence with the county assessor's office. One of those letters, dated 1997, was a response from the then assessor acknowledging receipt of the deed and confirming the Woodward parcel's tax-exempt status as a historic homestead. The assessor had known. The county had known. The digital migration in 2014 hadn't been an accident. It had been a convenient administrative error that someone had chosen not to correct. Alina spent the next week building the case. She subpoenaed the county's migration records and discovered that the Woodward parcel had been manually flagged for exclusion from the digital database, with an override code that traced back to a specific workstation in the assessor's office. The user ID belonged to a clerk named Patricia Keene, Harlan Keene's younger sister, who had worked in the office for 6 months before transferring to the zoning department, where her brother-in-law, Marcus Duval, was her direct supervisor. The pattern was emerging, and with each new thread, the conspiracy grew uglier. But the real it gets worse moment came on the 5th day. Alina's forensic document examiner, a meticulous woman named Dr. Iris Chen, called with an unexpected finding. While examining the land grant under ultraviolet light, she had discovered faint pencil marks on the back of the page, surveyor's notes, in my grandfather's handwriting, from 1956. They described the boundaries, yes, but they also described something else. A mineral discovery, specifically a vein of high-quality silica sand running beneath the northern third of the property, the exact section where Northlake had planned to build the marina and clubhouse. Silica sand, in the current market, was worth approximately $200 per ton in raw form, and the deposit, according to my grandfather's preliminary notes, was estimated at 1.7 million tons. That put the mineral rights value at over $300 million. Alina called me as soon as she got the report. "You need to sit down," she said. I was already sitting, in my kitchen, the wood stove finally repaired, a cup of coffee in my hand. She told me about the silica sand. I set the coffee down. "That's not possible," I said, echoing Keene's words from the station. "It's possible," she said, "and if the reversion clause holds, that sand is yours. The development wasn't just built on the wrong land, it was built on a gold mine they didn't even know was there." The news broke the next morning. Diane Hatcher's story ran on the front page of the county paper under the headline, "Arrested Hare Sits on $300 million Secret." Within hours, the story was picked up by state media, then national outlets. Northlake Development Group's investors started pulling out. The pre-sale buyers, wealthy retirees who had put down deposits on lakefront condos, filed a class action lawsuit against the town and the developer for fraud. The state attorney general's office announced an investigation into the annexation process and the digital record tampering. and Harlan Keene, the man who had arrested me for trespassing in my own home, was placed on administrative leave pending a criminal probe into conspiracy, official misconduct, and attempted fraud. But Keene wasn't done. A cornered man is dangerous, and Harlan Keene had been the law in Cedar Bluff for 2 decades. He had keys to every building, friends in every department, and a desperate, feral certainty that if he could just make the evidence disappear, the whole thing would collapse. On the evening of the 6th day, while I was in town buying groceries, someone broke into my house. Not to steal, nothing was taken. But the floorboard in the bedroom closet had been pried up, and the trunk was open. The leather folio was still there. Alina had taken the original for safekeeping in a bank vault, leaving a high-quality copy in its place. But the intruder had left something else behind. A typed note on plain paper with a single sentence, "Drop the claim or the house burns with you in it." I called Alina. She called the state police. By midnight, a patrol car was stationed at the end of my driveway, and a forensic team was dusting the house for prints. They found a partial thumbprint on the closet frame that matched an officer in Keene's department, a man named Deputy Roy Slater, who had a prior suspension for evidence tampering. Slater was arrested the next morning. He lawyered up immediately and, within hours, had agreed to testify against his boss in exchange for a reduced charge. The conspiracy that had started with a lost digital record was now a sprawling criminal case with multiple defendants, and at the center of it all was a yellowed piece of parchment that had been sitting quietly in a cedar trunk, waiting for someone to knock on the wrong door. But there was one more turn coming, the one that almost nobody saw coming, because it involved a detail that even Elena had missed. The land grant didn't just contain a reversion clause and mineral rights. It contained a covenant that ran with the land, binding on all successors, that required the Woodward heirs to maintain public access to the shoreline for recreational use. That covenant had been buried so deep in the legal language that the developers, in their haste to annex, had never found it. And now that the deed was public record, the covenant was enforceable, which meant that even if I wanted to sell the land to the highest bidder, I couldn't close off the lake, the luxury marina they'd planned, the private beach, the gated community. All of it would have to include a public boat launch, public fishing access, and a walking path maintained in perpetuity. The developers had been trying to buy exclusivity on land that legally could never be exclusive. When Alina explained this to me, sitting at my kitchen table with the wood stove crackling, I started laughing. Not the laugh of triumph, more like the laugh of a man who realized the universe had a very long memory and an extremely dark sense of humor. My grandfather hadn't just protected the family claim. He had protected the town, too, the real town, the people who had fished that lake for generations before some out-of-state developer decided to sell it back to them at a markup. And the covenant meant that no matter what happened in court, the lake would always belong to everyone. The civil trial was set for 3 months later. North Lake Development Group filed for bankruptcy protection. The town's insurance carrier announced it would not cover claims arising from intentional misconduct, leaving Cedar Bluff's municipal budget facing a $43 million liability. Mayor Briggs resigned. Marcus Duval was indicted on fraud charges. Tyler Keene, the architect, had his license suspended pending review. And Harlan Keene, former police chief, was arrested in his own station, the same one where he'd cuffed me, and charged with criminal conspiracy, evidence tampering, and filing a false police report. He posted bail and retreated to his house on the edge of town, where he spent his days staring at the lake he had tried to steal. As for me, I was still living in that 2-bedroom shack with the sagging porch. The national media trucks had come and gone. The legal motions were grinding through the courts. The silica sand rights were under negotiation with a mining company that promised to extract without disturbing the shoreline. And every morning, I walked down to the water's edge with my coffee, stood on the rocks my grandfather had stood on, and watched the mist rise off the lake. I was still broke. Technically, the wealth was in the ground and in the courts, but I was richer than I had ever been in my life. Because I had something that Harlan Keene and his entire machine had tried to take, and failed. I had proof that the oldest story in the book, the one about the little guy against the system. Sometimes, when the documents are true, and the lawyer is fierce, and the land itself has been waiting for justice, the little guy wins. But winning, as it turned out, was not a single moment. It was a slow, grinding machinery of justice that took months to fully turn, and the first thing I learned was that when you detonate a legal bomb under a town's entire economic future, the explosion doesn't stop with the people who planted the bomb. It ripples outward, through families, through businesses, through the brittle infrastructure of a small community that had been told for years that the development would save it. And when the development collapsed, so did everything built on its promise. The months between Keene's arrest and the final civil trial were a masterclass in consequences. Northlake Development Group declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy, not Chapter 11, liquidation, not restructuring. The marina site, already partially excavated, sat as a gaping wound in the shoreline, filling with rainwater that bred mosquitoes. The pre-sale condo deposits, totaling over $8 million, were tied up in bankruptcy proceedings that would take years to resolve. Construction contractors who had taken out loans for equipment filed their own lawsuits. The town's bond rating was downgraded to junk status, and the municipality laid off 15% of its workforce to cover the legal fees. Cedar Bluff, which had bet its future on a gated luxury enclave, was now a cautionary tale. The criminal cases moved faster. Roy Slater, the deputy who broke into my house, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and testified in excruciating detail about the instructions he'd received from Keene and Duvall. Patricia Keene, the clerk who had manually excluded my grandfather's parcel from the digital database, accepted a plea deal that required her to describe the entire scheme in open court. She confirmed what Alina had suspected. The digital error was authorized by Marcus Duvall, who had flagged the Woodward parcel for exclusion months before the annexation vote, knowing that if the land appeared unowned, the council would approve the development footprint without delay. She had done it because Marcus was family, because the development was supposed to make all of them rich, because she didn't think anyone would ever notice a 12-acre slip of paper in a basement vault. Harlan Keene's trial was the main event. The state prosecutor, a woman named Diane Wu, who had been brought in from the Attorney General's office to avoid local conflicts, built a case so thorough that Keene's defense attorney spent most of the trial objecting rather than presenting counter-evidence. The charges included criminal conspiracy, official misconduct, evidence tampering, filing a false police report, and solicitation of arson. The note left in my house had been traced to him through Slater's testimony and a handwriting analysis. Keene sat in the defendant's chair with the same gray pallor I'd seen in the station, his thick mustache now seeming less like a badge of authority and more like a relic from a man who had been hollowed out by his own ambitions. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, his wife left the courtroom without looking at him. He was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole in 8. Tyler Keene, his son, lost his architecture license and moved out of state. Marcus Duvall was convicted on fraud and conspiracy charges and received a 6-year sentence. The family machine that had run Cedar Bluff for a generation had been dismantled, bolt by bolt, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and floor wax. The civil trial was almost an afterthought by comparison, but it was the part that would determine my future. Alina and Gerald Poole had assembled a legal argument that was essentially bulletproof. The land grant was authentic. The reversion clause was unambiguous. The treble damages provision was triggered the moment Keene signed the arrest warrant. The judge, a federal appointee named Harrison Cole, who had been assigned to avoid local bias, ruled in summary judgment before the trial even reached opening statements. The 1872 deed was valid. The Woodward estate held clear title. The town's annexation of the property was void, and Northlake's contracts, all of them, were legally null. The treble damages award was calculated at $41.7 million to be paid from the town's insurance policy. The insurer had tried to deny coverage, but a separate ruling forced them to cover the liability, minus the intentional misconduct exclusions that applied to Keene and Duval personally. The town itself was bankrupt, but the insurance payment ensured that I would be compensated without crushing the municipal budget entirely. The judge also ordered the immediate cessation of all development activity on the lakefront, the restoration of the shoreline to its pre-construction state, and the enforcement of the public access covenant in perpetuity. I did not become an instant billionaire. The silica sand discovery, which had made international headlines, was still just a discovery. Extracting it would require environmental impact studies, mining permits, and a level of capital investment that I didn't have. But I didn't need to be the one to dig it up. Within weeks of the verdict, 3 mining companies approached me with offers to purchase the mineral rights. I chose the one that proposed the least invasive extraction method, a hydraulic borehole technique that would operate from a single pad behind the tree line, invisible from the lake. The deal netted me an upfront payment of $22 million, plus a royalty of 12% on all extracted material. The total value over the projected 30-year life of the mine was estimated at north of $200 million. I set aside enough to restore the old house, which I did with painstaking care, replacing the rotted boards with reclaimed cedar, rebuilding the porch so it no longer listed, and installing a wood stove that didn't date from the Reagan administration. The rest I placed in a trust, with instructions to preserve the shoreline and fund the public access covenant in perpetuity. I was rich, yes, but the money felt almost incidental. The real wealth was the knowledge that my grandfather's foresight had bent the arc of an entire town back toward justice. I lived in that house for another 2 years before I built a slightly larger one further back on the property, leaving the original as a guest cottage. Alina Ruiz became a partner in a major firm, and I made sure she received a bonus from the settlement that let her open a pro bono legal clinic in the county seat. The bakery below her old office still sells cinnamon rolls, and she still stops in every Thursday morning. Chief Keene's replacement was a woman named Alicia Torres, a former state trooper who implemented body cameras and civilian oversight within her first month. The town council, reconstituted with new members after a special election, passed an ordinance requiring paper and digital title verification before any land use decision. Cedar Bluff was not destroyed by the collapse of the shoreline development. It was, in a strange way, saved by it. The lake remained public. The cedar trees stayed standing. The luxury condos were never built, and in their place, the town voted to establish a public park with a fishing pier and a boat launch that anyone could use, free of charge. But there was one final detail in the leather folio that I hadn't noticed until after the trials were over. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter, handwritten, folded into a small rectangle, and tucked behind the land grant itself. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a pale brown, but my grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. It was dated June 16th, 2001, the year before his eyesight began to fail. It read, "Simply, if you are reading this, someone has tried to take the land. I'm sorry I wasn't there to fight them myself, but I knew this day might come. The clause was your great-great-grandfather's idea, the mineral survey was mine. The sand was always a backup. The real gift is the water. Protect it." There was no signature, just a small, familiar notation, a surveyor's mark, the same mark he'd used on every map and plat he'd ever drawn. When I finished reading, I walked down to the shoreline and stood on the rocks in the dark, the lake black and glassy under a quarter moon. I thought about the generations of men and women who had held that land, who had paid taxes on it, who had refused to sell even when the offers came, who had known, somehow, against all evidence, that the land was worth more than money. I thought about the police chief who had smirked at me in my own kitchen, and the moment that smirk cracked and fell apart. I thought about the leather folio, still intact, now sitting in a fireproof safe in my new basement. A testament to the quiet power of paper and ink and a family that understood that true ownership is not a claim. It is a responsibility, and that responsibility, I realized, had now passed to me. I still walk down to that shoreline every morning. The rocks are the same ones my grandfather stood on, the mist rises the same way, and the cedars still cast their long shadows across the water. Some days I bring the leather folio with me, not to read, I've memorized every line, but just to hold it, to remind myself that the most powerful weapon in the world is not a badge or a bulldozer. It's a piece of paper that tells the truth, and someone willing to stand behind it. The thing about small towns is that everyone knows each other's stories, but nobody tells the whole truth until someone forces the door open. Cedar Bluff is different now. The park is full of families who could never have afforded a luxury marina. The fishing pier is crowded on summer evenings. Nobody talks about Harlan Keene much, except as a warning, a man who believed his own authority was bigger than a 150-year-old promise. He was wrong. But here's what I think about most, in the quiet moments. My grandfather wasn't a rich man. He wasn't a lawyer or a politician. He was a surveyor who understood that the past doesn't disappear just because someone hits delete. He saved every receipt, every letter, every map, not because he was paranoid, but because he knew that someday someone would try to rewrite history. And when that day came, he made sure the truth would be waiting, folded in a leather folio, tied with a red ribbon. So I kept the public access covenant. I kept the shoreline free, because that's what the deed demanded, and that's what he would have wanted. The silica sand will pay for maintenance, for conservation, for making sure that long after I'm gone, this lake still belongs to the people who love it. That's not a victory lap. That's just finishing what he started. If you've been listening and this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It's the easiest way to support what we do here, and it ensures you don't miss the next one. We tell stories about people who stood their ground, people who had every reason to give up and didn't. If that sounds like your kind of thing, stick around. And remember, the quietest people often carry the loudest proof. My grandfather left me a leather folio and a reversion clause. What would you have done with it?